Hello, good morning. It's Sunday, June 23rd. My name is Tony Christ. Our sponsors are Odyssey Investments. Our program is Sunshine and Transparency. And I want to welcome you all here this morning. It's a late day, it's a Sunday, late time Sunday. I consider the topic today in Loco Parentis to be one of the most important topics we've ever discussed on this show. And we're going to spend some time on it. And I think it's so integrally related to what is going on in so many areas in America. I view it as a root cause, and that's why we're going to spend time on it. So, what does it mean? What does in loco parentis mean? Here, I'm a second generation Greek guy, and it's a Latin term. It means parenting in the absence of the parent. And what does exactly that mean? What does it look like? Well, I think I can explain it best by contrasting today with life in the 1950s and early 1960s when I was a young guy. I think it's easier to understand. So back in the day, adults used to parent. It wasn't due to a law. It was due to the fact that they were an adult. And it was socially acceptable for them to parent other people's children. Now, of course, that didn't mean they could take them out to the shed and whip them and leave them there all afternoon. Of course not. There were degrees of it. It had to be sensible, but it formed a network. It formed a guardrail, if you will, for young children, for adolescents, and young adults even to benefit as they matriculated up to adulthood. And again, it wasn't any legal requirement. There were no laws forcing it, but it was something people normally did. And you see it in almost every culture today, even cultures that have closed economies, dictatorships. You see it in cultures that claim to have more open economies, where a family unit will parent the child, a school system will parent the children, and also neighbors. If they see inappropriate behaviors or even unlawful behaviors, they will jump in and parent to a degree that child and form an adult guardrail for those kids all the way to adulthood. So, what's happened in America? What's changed? And why should we be alarmed about those changes? Okay, well, one thing we should be alarmed about, and this is on record, October 24th, 2022, article in the New York Times. Math and reading proficiency among fourth graders has sunk. Proficiency is now at 36% for reading and 36% for math and 33% for reading. Now, that's only a third of all fourth graders, according to the New York Times, were proficient in math and reading. Only one third. Now, you're talking about a school system, K through 12, fourth grade's right at the beginning of it, where last century we were peerless in the world, not only in America. So it's not only a substantial decline for us today academically, it's a substantial decline in the world. And when you go up to eighth grade, this is the same article, October 24th, 2022, New York Times, 26% in eighth grade are proficient in math and 31% are proficient in reading. It's only a quarter of all eighth graders have math proficiency, and 31% are proficient in reading. Now that's pathetic. Now here we're talking about parenting. So what does that have to do with proficiency scores declining? Well, that's the whole point of it. We have to connect those two dots because they are related. Now, how can we illustrate that? Well, let's look, before we get into what's going on today, let's look at the past. Let's take an example. Little Johnny goes into fourth grade, and he's a little disruptive. The teacher had every authority back in the 1950s and 1960s to tell little Johnny to be quiet and sit down. And if he didn't listen, she had every authority to discipline him within reason. Now, again, she didn't take him out to the shed and beat him. No, but she had the ability to make him stay after school. She had the ability to make him write on the blackboard 25, 50 times, I will not, whatever he was doing, do it again, over and over again. She had the ability, and I hate to admit it, it's a bit embarrassing, to wear a dunce cap. She had the ability to draw a circle on the blackboard, have him come up and put his nose in it. I actually had to do both those things in fourth grade. Okay, I never forget Mrs. Moore, my teacher. So basically, the teacher had the authority to repress that inappropriate behavior, and by doing that, who benefited? Well, the rest of the class. I mean, if you have one kid doing inappropriate behaviors in class, it can disrupt the whole class. It prevents the whole class from advancing for a certain period of time. And if it's repeated over and over again, it's going to be highly disruptive and reduce the instructional time for the rest of the class. Now, that was the way it was. And also, I might add, if you got up to high school, there was truancy. You had a legal obligation to have a kid in high school until they were 16. But if they were a bad apple repeatedly, they were expelled. They were out of the high school system. Now, how is that handled differently today? And we're going to discuss that too. And why might these differences about parenting by teachers, why might these differences have influenced scores and likely cause scores to decline? That's a large part of what we're going to discuss today. So now let's go to today. Okay, and let's take an actual incident, okay, that occurred last year in an elementary school. Abraham is a 7-year-old turning 8 in second grade. Every morning in school that he enters into, he goes into a ritual during which he stands up, paces up and down, and cries and screams. Now, in the 50s and 60s, the teacher would have grabbed him by the ear, sat him back down a few times. If it didn't work, he would have been disciplined. He would have had to stay after school. His parents would have been informed because he was only in second grade. He would have had to have written on the blackboard if he is able to write in second grade. There would have been a number of things that would have been exhausted to repress that kind of behavior. But not today. Today it's not repressed. So what does happen? Well, the teacher's responsible to document the behavior and to ask Abraham why he's doing this. Well, this is an actual case now. So Abraham says, my dad spanked me. Okay. Well, now let me be very clear. There's no sign of Abraham being abused. There's no marks on Abraham that are visible. There's no sign that he's being abused, because that, of course, would be a different matter. The attention goes to the father and the mother and their ability to parent, or what the school is interpreting as their inability. They're not parenting correctly. Now, that never was the business of a school. Okay, school was about ABCs, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Okay, that was it. They stayed out of emotional developments. They stayed out of other things, although they did have the right to discipline while you were in school. So all of a sudden, psychological departments come and get involved. Other professionals that never existed, that used to be the duty of that single teacher, are brought into the picture, and the teacher has been effective. Now, neuter is a sexual term, but they've been effectively neutered from parenting. They've been disallowed to correct that child. And also I might add, the child repeats the behavior. In Abraham's case, this went on a whole semester because that teacher was not allowed to repress that behavior. That's how the role has changed, only to document it and to turn it over to professionals, so-called professionals in the school system. And the father was called in. And, this is such first of all, it's a waste of resources. Secondly, it's so disruptive to the rest of the kids who are trying to learn their ABCs in the class itself. But this is the way education has changed. So teachers are no longer allowed to be or trusted to be parental disciplinarians because they may have different ways and different approaches to it. And the school system, the central authorities only want one approach and they want unanimity in it. So they want everybody to do the same thing. Well, guess what? When that kid comes into class, he realizes that teacher's been neutered right away. These kids aren't dummies and they're going to behave accordingly. They're going to know they can pull out cell phones when they need to. They're going to know they can chat on the side whenever they want to. There's no consequence, eminent consequence. There's that delayed consequence of having a professional come in a week or two and call him in for a session, or her in for a session. But there's no consequence to that kind of behavior, and the teacher has no way to enforce it. So what happens? The academics go down. The ability for that kid to learn declines and declines and declines. And you don't see this type of destructive behavior going on in other cultures. Okay, so this is one of the main reasons, the lack of parenting, taking parenting out of the classroom in loco parentis, in the old Latin, in the absence of the parent, I am your parent, no longer holds. That's what was applied in our country successfully for, I want to say, almost 200 years. And now in the last half century, it's gone down the toilet. The central education authorities, be they federal or state, or even higher up in the education bureaucracy in counties, are controlling the teachers' behaviors. Now, also, I might add too, teachers used to make their own lesson plans. They did not have dictated lesson plans. Today, there are centrally controlled lesson plans of what you should do. There may be some wiggle room in choosing this book over that book, but it's very narrow. Now, back in the day, teachers were respected. They were allowed to be disciplinarians. They were allowed to create their own lesson plans. Of course, if you're teaching geometry, you don't want to have a lesson plan with history in it. But they were all very incented, and they did their own disciplining, and they, as part of their teaching job, would stay after school with that kid when he was a disciplinary problem. And if it went on and on, they would involve an assistant principal or an administrative person, and it could theoretically go on to a suspension if they were in high school, or even if they were older than truancy back in the day, it would involve an expulsion. Now, today, what do? Well, when that kid is a repeat offender, and of course he hasn't been repressed at any stage during K through ninth grade, and he's a repeat offender and he turns 16, they will take him and transfer him to another school. Say, this is a problem for us. Just put him over here. So they take that rotten apple and put him in another barrel. And I don't know what the theory is there, but rotten apples do tend to rot out the whole barrel. And the tragedy is there's no expulsion way for the school system anymore. Okay, and they're pandering and spending money on kids that aren't really responding correctly regarding reading, writing, and arithmetic, which is what they should be focused on. So that's the academic portion of it. Now, when you have a loss of in loco parentis, a loss of parenting in the family, what does that look like? Well, we've talked about on previous podcasts how 60 to 80% of your emotional development occurs before you're 6. Your basic concepts of right and wrong are determined by your emotional development. And in the absence of that, they're not formed correctly. There's nothing to form them. In other words, they don't occur uh, in nature. They're part of social modeling. They require a mom and a dad. So let's take a look at this. What's happened to the family unit? Well, we've had since 1965, since welfare came into being. The prior to welfare, you had actually 5% of Caucasian families were being raised in single parent environments. And we'll talk about why single parent makes it almost impossible to transfer some of these moral and ethical principles to young children, 0 to 6 year olds, in a moment too. But so 5% in 1965 were single parent Caucasian families. Afro-American families were 16, I think 16%, and overall was 7%. 7% of all families were single parent. So let's fast forward. You have Johnson's Great Society and nuclear family, which was actually a misnomer. It was actually, well, nuclear is the correct term because it blew up the family. And you have, I would call it the destruction of the family, the beginning of the destruction of the family unit. And today, by the government statistics, 33% of all children are raised in single parent environments. And I've seen statistics going over 40%. Now, that environment does not allow, particularly if the mother has to work, if she's not totally dependent on welfare, does not allow a single parent the ability to mold those children in their first years. I mean, she's working, she's going to get home in the evening, that kid's going to be out with other kids and not at home, and there's not going to be any easy way that kid is going to have enough inputs with a single parent. Now there are exceptions. I mean, you're going to always get an exception, and there's a number of them out there, but the overwhelming majority of those children in single parent environments are almost condemned to poverty, and a single parent environment is an environment of poverty, and you can't. It's hard to escape it. So that has been a very destructive thing to the development of the moral and ethical concepts and constructs that form that are a part of your early emotional development. Understanding right from wrong, understanding what you can do and what you're not, what you should do and what you shouldn't do. These aren't laws. They're things we get from our mom and dad and our siblings and our immediate peers, and if you take a parent out of it and you only have one, and that one is saddled with all the financial responsibilities, you're going to be absent a lot of those things. And so the environment has not only been sterilized for parenting from K through 12, which the central government and the boards of ed in almost every location in the nation have done. It's been sterilized from the time of birth for fully over a third. I'm going to say 33 to 40% of all children. So there's actually no. So is there any question why these children are going to bounce their heads into law enforcement? I mean, they've had no repression all the way through their growing up. They've not had any formative development or concepts of right or wrong, and they're going to keep acting out without the guardrails, without the parenting, until they butt their heads into the police. Okay, people shouldn't be surprised. They shouldn't be surprised that absentee fathers explain most the violence in males. the correlation is astronomical between violent males and absentee fathers. I mean, even a bad dad is better than no dad. Now, that's within reason, of course, but you know, you don't have to be a perfect dad. But if you had a dad and you could choose a number of different disciplinary methods, it doesn't have to be taking your kid to the shed. You could restrict them to their room, take their cell phone away, take their allowance away, on and on and on. But you had some active, proactive interaction between the parents, in this case, a father and a son, that helped mold that son and didn't and wasn't absent. That's where the numbers go off the charts. So basically, you can see now. Now let's take a third aspect of it: the neighborhood. Uh, now, I'll tell you a little secret today. Back in the 50s and 60s, moms and dads used to let kids roam the neighborhoods. And I mean, I was 6 or 7 years old, and it was within reason. I could go a few blocks north and south with my other friends, and nobody was perturbed. Now, the interesting statistic is back then, there were more children abused and murdered than there are today. But today, there's a general phobia with parents, and they keep their children they keep their children under locks. And what they should be afraid of is the internet. So these little kids and preteens and teens are on the internet for 7 hours a day in many instances, some 4.4 hours. And statistically, there's a correlation between mental problems and time spent on the internet that's off the charts. And fully 25% of these preteens and early teens have made suicide plans that are overly spending time on the internet. So the internet, in my opinion, is so much more dangerous to the emotional development of these young kids than allowing them to go free and in the yard with their kids, which is actually more safe today. Now you're going to hear a story about a violent crime against a young girl or a kidnapping. You're always going to, but it's more safe today than allowing a kid to go on the internet. And you should take that to fact. And so if you want to monitor something, monitor the use of those phones. They are really undermining academic achievement, and they're causing emotional basket cases, and they're separating kids from having direct contact with other children, which is essential in development. You have to have human to human contact. You can't establish all your friends from reading bios on Facebook. Actually, there's a direct correlation between Facebook users and depression. The more they use it, the higher the depression rate. Now, that's true for everyone that uses Facebook. So I'm not saying not to use Facebook. I'm just pointing out to you that the real danger today for young children growing up is not going and playing in the neighborhood. It's a matter of fact, it's far less dangerous than it used to be. It's using cell phones, using the new type of cell phone, and going to games on it, and going to sites like TikTok and spending hours on it. That's an emotional danger for that child. If nothing else, it takes up 7, 8 hours a day. I mean, how can a kid start to learn to get a merit-oriented approach to their lives when they're spending 7 or 8 hours a day glued addictively to a site, be it Meta, be it TikTok or whatever? You know, it's crazy. So that's a big mistake all parents are making today. But parenting in general, okay, used to occur in neighborhoods. So you had back in the day in the 50s and 60s when I was a kid, you were able to run around your neighborhood and do things. I mean, I'll never forget. I got caught throwing an egg at a brick wall attached to a neighbor's house, and Mrs. Olawini caught me. That was the neighbor's house I hit with the egg, and she not only went and told my mother. I was about 8 years old. She got me materials to clean the whole brick wall. Now, needless to say, after I cleaned that whole brick wall and she inspected it, and after at 8 years old, and believe me, when you're 8, it seems like it takes forever to clean it. When you're young, time goes very slow. And do you think I ever threw another egg at a brick wall? No, that was the only brick wall I ever threw an egg at. But had not Mrs. Olawany parented, okay, even today, uh, there's this attitude among neighbors that that's someone else's kid. Let them handle it. They don't even want to get involved. And that was not the world that we grew up in. See, parenting provides guardrails, and guardrails provide directions. You're gonna bounce around in a guardrail as you're growing up. You're gonna hit one side and hit the other. But if you don't have guardrails, oh wow, you're gonna go off the tracks. You're gonna go off the tracks. And you go all the way off the tracks, you run into the police. Well, there was no need for that if there were guardrails in the neighborhood. And when I see today many of these shooters, and the fact that their isolations were entrenched for long periods of time, and there were many symptoms where they were crying out for help. Well, back in the 50s and 60s, there would have been any number of people that would have come in and started correcting and challenging their behaviors long before they took that rifle and went out and shot a bunch of people. So that's another example of where the loss of in loco parentis is dramatically changing these kids and leading to very negative and destructive results in society. So I tend to think the loss of in loco parentis might be the most elemental and most important thing that is not being addressed in America today. Now, so we talked about how welfare influenced it. Welfare has greatly influenced it because it mitigated the responsibility of a father for a child he created. Now, how do you say it mitigated it? They still have to pay alimony. Well, if you go and check the reality of it and the number of alimony cases that are filed, they're not pursued. The government steps in and becomes the provider, and that sort of mitigates the need. And even if you look in communities where they've had multiple childbirths, women, you can see they almost prefer to throw the guy out in the morning. They almost view it economically. If I get another child, I'm going to get a few more dollars. So they keep throwing the kids out and collecting the money from the government. Very sad state of affairs because they go right into an environment where there's not adequate parenting. They go into an environment of poverty, and it has a huge the likelihood of getting out of that is very slim to none for people their whole lives. And without that early parenting and that early emotional development, it's extremely difficult, even in a merit-based system. And we're going to talk about how merit has declined, how merit modeling has declined quite a bit in the last decade or two. You can't really get out and change your reality. And now there again, you're going to have 1 in 100 show up and become a medical doctor and or whatever. But statistically, they're almost anomalous. They're not that frequent. Okay, they're not that frequent. The vast majority are trapped for life in single parent environments. So you had that development. So welfare brought something new. It not only was a huge financial obligation that has grown considerably. I mean, today we have as many as 100 welfare programs. It not only was something that attracted a lot of foreigners to come to the country and incentivized economically bad people like cartels to advertise that America has free this and free that. For example, our hospital systems today, anybody can go in, any alien can go in and say, my chest hurts, and get a number of treatments that are hundreds and hundreds of dollars for free. Matter of fact, a couple of weeks ago, a 30 hospital chain just went out of business went totally broke. Now, you're talking about a country that has been very liberal with its expenditures on medicine. Uh, I use a number of 15.5%. We're in the coming weeks, we're going to be speaking about this. Uh, Spent on medicine. Some people are as high as 18% of our whole economy is spent on medicine, and it's not efficient at all. But we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. But the point to take away here is part of this welfare system, this giveaway system, has invited tens of thousands of people to the country for particularly to participate in welfare without making a contribution, without being a citizen of the country. And this has been a hideously onerous expense for our medical purveyors, our hospital systems, which are going bankrupt left and right this year in 2024. And it doesn't look like it's subsiding. So there's that effect too, the secondary effect of welfare, I call it, that's affecting almost every aspect of our lives. And it's all tied directly back to the loss of in loco parenting, the loss of in the absence of the parent not having a parent. So I mean, if you don't have parenting when you're 1 to 6, if you've taken the parent out of the teacher when you're 6 to 18, then when after you get to be 18, you're going to go to college, you're going to go in society, but you're absent that parenting. So let's look today at some very bright kids at some Ivy League schools that are acting very tribally. Well, of course, we don't like to see people slaughtered in war. It's a terrible, terrible thing when innocents are slaughtered in war. But the point is, it goes on with every war. And the difference this time is there's not been such a press focus where we see pictures of it every day. You don't see it. I mean, you can go back to almost every foreign engagement in war, and I think statistically, 10 civilians die for every soldier. Okay, and they're the ones without the guns, and they're right in the middle of the fight. And it's a tragedy, and it's so sad. But these kids are becoming tribal. They're being incented by other monies and other people with other intentions, and they're showing no regard for the academic process, the process of learning, the process of learning what to do, and they're becoming totally dogmatic and fixed in a way which is the exact opposite of what they should be doing in college. They should be open-minded. They should be curious and exploring every issue. And many of them, I can tell you, have not had the kind of parenting and have gone through school systems where parenting has been taken out of the school system, and they emotionally are subject to these triggers. They're young adults, they're not fully grown, and they're triggered, and their behaviors are dogmatic and destructive. And when I think back the Vietnam War protests, which I participated in, okay, I did show up and was rejected my physical. I didn't get into the military, but when I was at William and Mary, I participated in some of the demonstrations, and I think about that group. We maintained our merit orientation and return to merit seeking merit type behaviors, and this group is almost destructive in that regard. This group is not showing any interest in merit, and they're not taking any responsibility for their own actions. That's, I think, maybe the most troubling thing. But they've gone through this system from lack of parenting, many, not all, lack of parenting in early childhood prior to school, the parent being taken out of the school, the community ceasing to parent children in the neighborhoods, and that environment has invited them to acting tribally, even though they're young adults, even though their IQs may be 150. They didn't have that emotional fine tuning when they were young, and so the consequences are extremely severe. It's being tolerated all through K through 12. It's being tolerated on college campuses. I mean, there comes a point where you have to put your foot down and you have to say, this has to stop. We're not here to promote demonstrations or champion causes. We're here to keep an open mind and learn. So that's a huge effect too. Now, what else? So this is a negative effect of government interfering in the family unit. And we talked about 1965, the total average of single parent families was 7%. Well, after welfare, if we fast jump up to 2010, what do you think the single parent family went to? Well, I'm going to tell you, for whites, it went up to 32 to 33% from 5. For blacks and Hispanics, it went up to 58%, blacks 76% of all Afro-American families are single parent. Overall, 42%. Now, I said the government has a statistic of 33, but I also said if you read other literature, the number is higher. So I tend to go with something near 40%. That's a huge number of children being reared in what I call either with a minimum of parenting or absence of parenting. When they get into the public school environment, there's an absence of parenting. And that is where the root of the problem is. And then, so was it enough to eviscerate the family with welfare? Was that enough? Or was the government going to come up with something else? Well, they did. They did come up with something else. On August 21st, 1996, HIPAA came up with a formal privacy rule. And the privacy rule gave anyone that turned 18 medical privacy, academic privacy. From whom? From their parents. Now, this is a very personal thing to me because we lost our son at University of Virginia. And had I known he was doing heroin, I would have gone down and pulled him out in a New York second. And my wife was a nurse at the time. And she, 5 years later, got his records. And he was caught as a freshman, 17 years old, in the fall of his freshman year, smoking pot and drinking beer. And he was told to go for counseling. He went for counseling. Now, we weren't allowed to know about these records at the time, okay, because of this new HIPAA rule, okay. And he went for counseling for one session. And the interviewer wrote in the records that it takes Brian 6 or 7 beers to get high. Well, that should have been a red flag. If he's drinking that much as a freshman at college and bragging about it, that should have been a red flag, but it wasn't because of HIPAA. And and I'm not against privacy of medical records amongst adults, but amongst families, I'm against it. You got to let the family know. If you want to have any integrity or any resemblance of a historic family in America, you've got to respect that. So basically, that's all that was entered into the record. And then 3 years later, there was a record made that Brian came in and he was worried he had an infection because he had shot heroin. And we told him to go to the hospital. There was no telling the mom and dad, just pay the bill and shut up. Okay, we had no idea. And I can tell you it was the hardest day of my life going down with my wife to get his electrical engineering graduate degree posthumously. Okay. And had we known, parents will devote whatever time is needed to do whatever they need to do. So HIPAA privacy drove another wedge into the traditional family. It cut 18-year-olds off not only for medical, but from grades and medical. They had to give you a written permission slip to see the grades. Like I said, it was just pay the bill and shut up. And gave that kid, not all kids, of course, but gave a few kids on college campuses an isolated environment. And when you're that age, you think you're indestructible, to practice behaviors that could lead to addictions and lead to destruction. And I mean, Brian would have never harmed a fly, but he certainly harmed himself. And if you go to Vic at Virginia Tech is another example. I think he shot 19 people, and there was a record 2 years of behaviors that were alarming, and his parents were never notified. And he was Vietnamese. And I remember in the Northern Virginia newspapers, his mother saying after his death and the death of 19 Virginia Tech teachers and students, saying, if I had only known what he was doing, I would have withdrawn him from school. So the privacy is against the parents. Okay, it's against the family unit. I mean, there were people we talked to afterwards. They knew Brian was doing that. Friends, he lived with other engineers in a house off campus behind the stadium, and they knew what he was doing, but we didn't know. So the privacy is an ineffective privacy. The departments didn't know. They suspected it though. In other words, when I was in college, if you didn't show up long enough, there was communication to your parents that you weren't going to class. That was part of their parenting. Today, there isn't, or it's very nominal if it exists at all. And that's another example of how the lack of parenting can lead, indirectly to a destructive outcome. So HIPAA's amendment to the privacy rule in 1996 greatly affected a small group of individuals, particularly those involved in addictive behaviors and destructive behaviors, because it cut the parents out. And that is a tragedy that's ongoing, even in the fentanyl environments today, which are very tragic. So let's see where we are, and let's sum up. Before I sum up, I want to tell you, we're going to go back and do a podcast on our second podcast on Is There a God next week. We're going to talk about why up to 90% of people in the world believe there's a power greater than man, and what that looks like among the two major groups, the anthropomorphic group of believers, which is by far the largest group, and the group that believe God's in everything. And we're going to talk about those differences next week. Following that, we're going to get into a very interesting 2-week discussion on the U.S. medical system. We're going to look at the issues on a paper I wrote back in 2008 prior to Obamacare. And we're going to carry it up then a week later in how those issues have prevailed and how expensive they are and how ineffective they are at allocating medical services, inefficient and ineffective, and require great amounts of money to be spent. And then after that, we're going to look at an efficient, decentralized system in Switzerland and compare our current medical system the week after that to the Swiss system. So those are the next 3 weeks of things coming up. And we hope you'll stay tuned. We'll try to have our podcast up on Sundays. Our podcast is always recorded on odysseyyinvestments.info. It's called Sunshine and Transparency. I'm Tony Christ, and we're trying to bring issues to attention. Now, there's always a paper, and it's important that you know this. There's always a paper written about every issue, and you can find the paper on the website under consensus. Many of the papers are only 2 pages long. A few of them are a little bit longer. It's worth reading the paper. I can tell you the paper hits things right on the head better than my podcast. So you're, of course, welcome to do both. So if you want to watch the podcast, watch it. If you don't, go to the site odysseyinvestments.info. That's odysseyinvestments.info. See consensus, depress it. We're on, I think, the 32nd paper. Next week, we're doing Is There a God? It will be 33. Next week, we're doing the medical shortfalls in our system, 34. The week after, we're going to compare our medical system with what I consider to be a very efficient system in Switzerland and cheaper one. We're going to see how we might go about correcting our system. So, and that would be podcast number and paper number 35. So those are the next 3 weeks. The takeaway from In Loco Parentis is the following. Don't be afraid to allow your kids to play in neighborhoods. Be afraid of the cell phone. The cell phone is having a profoundly more destructive effect on children, particularly preteens. Be scared to death and control it all the way to 18. And I mean it. If you want to have your kid come out of the whole educational experience with a half a chance, you better control the cell phone and let them meet other children, let them play, let them go out. There's a danger to everything. It's a minimal danger compared statistically to what it was when in the 1960s and 50s. So don't be overly protective of your children as far as playing in the neighborhood. Be overly protective with their cell phone. That's takeaway number 1. Takeaway number 2, if you're an adult over 25, I mean, many people, you can't even call them adults at 35, but if you're an adult and you see other children, adolescents, or young adults doing destructive or addictive behaviors, don't hesitate to advise them of such, and don't hesitate to tell their parents. Tell them. Don't be a coward. Don't avoid it. Get involved. You're the adult, okay? Don't be timid and turn the other way. So that's takeaway number 2. And takeaway number 3 is, and I don't know how we fix number 3, the PTAs or the parent-teacher associations must demand to restore parenting to the classroom teacher. For God's sakes, respect that teacher. They're adults. Let them administer parenting. Let them administer discipline. Let them have kids stay after school when they're out of line. So those kids develop a rightful fear that teacher is going to make them stay after school, make them do something they don't want to do. And that's a healthy thing to the educational process. That's what the teacher can contribute. To neuter them, not sexually, but to neuter them as far as parenting in the classroom, that kid realizes it. And they say, oh, I'll go to school, I'll take out my cell phone, I'll do this, I'll do that. That's my day at school. No. You have to instill parenting back in the teacher through the PTAs. You have to break the backbone of this administrative education system that's top heavy, controlled by the top, and trying to administer controls, singular controls, to say all 4th graders, to say all 8th graders that are all the same, when they're not on scene and they're inhibiting the classroom teacher from doing it. That has to change. So those are your 3 takeaways. So I hope you found this productive. Again, and this is the last time I'll say it, but the loss of In Loco Parentis on those 3 levels has been staggering, and we're going to pay the toll for it for years. And I want at least you to leave this podcast with being made aware of it. At least you're aware of what's happening. And I wish you a blessed week. I hope you tune in next week when Sunshine and Transparency will be talking about Is There a God? Part 2. It's a very fascinating metaphysical discussion. And I personally believe there is. I tell you to have a blessed week. And I look forward to talking to you next week. And God bless.